Mr. Chairman, Mr. Garland, Facebook has admitted in a letter to the Arizona Attorney General that it, quote, allows people to share information about how to enter a country illegally or request information about how to be smuggled, close quote. 8 U.S.C. 1324 criminalizes aiding and abetting entry into the U.S. By illegal aliens. Have you sent a letter or issued a memorandum similar to the 10-421 memorandum directing departmental resources to be dedicated to investigating the apparent violation of law, similar to the one? Have you done that?
I haven't seen the letter or information that you're talking about, but if it was sent to the department, I'll make sure that we look at it.
It has been reported that Mark Zuckerberg also spent over $400 million in a, quote, carefully orchestrated attempt, close quote, to influence the 2020 election. Those efforts have been referred to as a, quote, private takeover of government election operations, close quote. Have you sent a letter or issued a memorandum directing departmental resources be dedicated to investigate these claims?
I don't know what was done in 2020 in the previous administration of the Justice Department.
We're talking about the election of 2020. All of this has come out since then, and you've not.
I don't know.
Totally unaware of that?
I'm not aware of what you're talking about. I'm sorry.
So you have not sent a memo, or you're not investigating that either. Last Sunday, more than 300 churches in Virginia aired a video featuring Vice President Harris advocating the election of Terry McAuliffe as governor of Virginia. This appears to violate Section 501c3 of the IRS Code, as well as other election laws, and seems to be an orchestrated effort by the VP and McAuliffe to violate the law. Have you sent a letter or issued a memorandum directing departmental resources be dedicated to investigating this apparent violation of law, similar to the letter you issued, or excuse me, the memorandum you issued on October 4th targeting parents who exercise their First Amendment rights at local school boards?
No.
On May 24th, 2021, under oath before a congressional committee, Dr. Anthony Fauci denied the National Institute of Health provided any funding for gain-of-function research, saying, quote, that categorically was not done, close quote. Today, this very day, the NIH issued a statement contradicting that testimony, which suggests that Dr. Fauci may have committed perjury. This is a criminal offense, and I'm left to wonder if you intend to look into that and send a communication such as a letter or a memo similar to the October 4th memo that you issued regarding parents going to school board meetings to investigate Dr. Fauci's potential perjury.
Again, I'll refer to the long-standing departmental norm that we don't comment about investigations pending or unpending. The general point that you're making normally would come with a referral from the relevant committee, but other than that, I can't say anything.
The actual point I'm making is you chose, as a response to a letter from the National School Board Association, and as you said earlier today, newspaper accounts, to issue a memorandum to organize task force and investigate and put a chill on parents' participation before school boards. Now you say, oh, I didn't mean to provide a chill, but that's exactly what any sentient being would have assumed would happen when you asked the federal government to begin looking into this. Of course parents are going to be nervous now. Of course people will step back. That's the purpose of my questioning. So when we get to these things like Zuckerberg, Facebook, Kamala Harris, we get to, and Dr. Fauci's purported perjury, there's no indication. You didn't hold back. You issued a press release. Do you see the distinction? How about this one? Since January 20 of 2021, Border Patrol has encountered more than 1.3 million aliens at the southwest border trying to illegally enter the country. You yourself have acknowledged today that that remains a crime. Have you sent a letter or issued a memorandum to U.S. attorneys directing prosecution of these cases?
No, and the reference of cases comes from the Department of Homeland Security, as I mentioned before.
Look, you managed to issue a memorandum about parents showing up at school boards. Why can't you issue a memorandum regarding the million-plus people who illegally enter the country and encouraging your U.S. attorneys to prosecute those cases. They are there constantly.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Ms. Correa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, welcome and thank you for your good work. I wanted to turn back to the issue of safety of elected officials, federal and local. You mentioned a couple of words.
Something that doesn't exist, tell that to the Border Patrol agents. They got till November 1st. If they don't get a vaccine, they're fired. That exists. Tell that to the healthcare workers who just got canned in New York. The heroes, you all called them heroes. We all called them heroes because they were a year ago. Tell that to them. Something that doesn't exist. That is the dumbest thing I've heard said today. Holy cow. Tell the Border Patrol agents who've been busting their tail for now month after month, record illegal crossings every single month. March was the highest month on record until April. April was the highest month on record until May. May was the highest month on record until June. June was the highest month on record until July. 212,000 illegal encounters in that month alone. Something that doesn't happen. They're going to lose their job if they don't do what Joe Biden says. And you say something that doesn't happen. Oh my goodness. You said this was a waste of our time. This is maybe the most important thing we can talk about, the freedoms that are being taken from the very people we represent, something that doesn't exist. You got to be kidding me. This is the kind of stuff that just ticks me off because this is so basic. The Constitution, I mean, this is fundamental liberty we're talking about, people's livelihoods, and you give us a lecture on something that doesn't exist.
Will the gentleman yield then?
No, I will not. That is truly unbelievable. These Border Patrol agents, they know it exists. They know it exists. Oh, and here's the irony of that one. We just had a briefing from Mr. Mayorkas, Secretary Mayorkas. You know what he said? When the people who violate the law come across, they're offered a chance to take the vaccine. They get a choice. They get a choice, but not the guys who busted their tail, working hard, protecting us. All they get is attacked by you guys. If they happen to ride a horse, they get attacked by you guys. They don't get a choice. No, this exists. This is a darn good amendment from my friend and colleague from North Carolina. This definitely exists. It is a fundamental issue the country is dealing with as we speak.
Mr. Royce, seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Well, as the gentlelady on the other side of the aisle knows, I too live in Texas. Raised my son, daughter to respect firearms. We shoot them frequently on our property. We shoot semi-automatic weapons on my property. I teach my children how to use them safely. I teach them what they're used for, why we have the ability to have firearms. And yes, we use it for hunting. My son shot his first deer.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Briefly.
Yeah, very question. What do you use semi-automatic weapons for?
I use semi-automatic weapons to kill hogs. I use semi-automatic weapons for sport and shooting on our property, but I also have semi-automatic weapons, and I'm getting to the point.
Thank you.
Because a semi-automatic weapon is a weapon that you can use for self-defense. It is a semi-automatic weapon that you can use to defend yourself against home invaders, but also, let's be clear, against tyranny. The gentlelady is talking about the Second Amendment in the context of hunting, as if my rights are reduced in the Constitution to a 410 or a single shot or lever action 22, as if that was what was expressly put forth as how we're supposed to be defending ourselves.
Gentleman yield again?
And let me go ahead and finish my time, sir, unless we want to add more time.
Very, very quickly, question.
I need more time. Will the gentleman give me another 30 seconds?
Yes.
Okay, I'll yield.
You said that you could use a semi-automatic weapon to fight tyranny.
Sure.
You mean you'd use it against American troops?
The very existence of the Second Amendment is designed purposefully to empower the people to be able to resist the force of tyranny used against them to step over their natural rights given to them by God. That is why the Second Amendment exists. That is very specifically why the Second Amendment exists. And let's be very clear about that. let's rewind the clock a little bit, as I know at least several justices have written in Supreme Court opinions, but about what life looked like in the 19th century and what the government was doing to remove the ability of either slave owners or, importantly, freed blacks, or importantly, whites who even stood up in defense of blacks or against slavery, and the efforts by the South and the efforts by the strong arm of government to remove their ability to have firearms. That is an absolute, undeniable, documented, historic fact in our country. As written by Robert Verbruggen in the National Review, and I'm happy to submit this to the record without objection, he writes, "The heart of the problem is that in an effort to stave off rebellion and maintain the racial caste structure that had developed under slavery, state and local governments refused to respect freedmen's constitutional rights. Crucial to the South's efforts were gun control laws that applied to blacks and blacks alone. This does not show that," and it goes on further, I'm going to take too longer, where it goes into the South's campaign against black gun ownership, not surprisingly, began long before the Civil War. Two slave rebellions in the 1820s stoked whites' fears, and in response, many legislatures amended their laws prohibiting slaves from carrying firearms to apply the prohibition to free blacks as well. When the government, and he writes further, and I agree with this, when the government has the ability to forbid gun ownership, it has the ability to render groups it dislikes helpless to defend themselves, regardless of whether modern gun control accomplishes its purpose of reducing crime. And for the record, there is no evidence it does. And I agree with that as well. This is so inherent to the very conversation we're having. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle just blithely dismiss due process. A former judge even saying, arguments about due process, you have the opportunity to be heard after. You have the opportunity to be heard after your rights have been taken away. That's the key issue here. We are absolutely destroying the bedrock principle that your rights are given to you by God and that you can't just have to go to the government to ask permission to exercise those rights. And when you
would the
do
gentleman
that,
yield for a question? Could I ask Mr. Roy a question? Would you yield for a second?
I need to finish up my time. I already have a few seconds left over from the chairman. I'm happy to engage with you in colloquies later. And I would point out that my colleague from Maryland, again, just sort of rolled over the fact that it was very express in the Supreme Court's ruling that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia. My colleagues like to continually try to connect that to militia service, but we all know that what a militia looked like in 1775 and 1776. I appreciate that the chairman gave me a little extra time in light of our exchange and questioning. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back for what purpose?
I'm from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
And with the chairman's permission, I defer to Mr. Gates from Florida.
Mr. Gates is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is my favorite subcommittee in my half-decade in Congress, and in no small part because of the way you've led it. I am incredibly proud of the work we have done to address some of these anti-competitive practices of these monopolistic entities. And I was particularly persuaded by the testimony of Mr. Gross regarding how that market power of big businesses like Amazon can limit the ability of workers to have any type of meaningful negotiation. Congresswoman Jayapal led legislation that the chairman of the committee, the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Buck, and myself supported that would force the breakup of companies like Amazon into smaller entities. And I wanted Mr. Gross's perspective on that. Do you believe, as a negotiator, that would improve the position of workers to break up companies like Amazon and other big tech companies into smaller entities?
Well, I'm not an expert on this field. You know, obviously I'm just a driver at UPS and the shop steward for my union. But what I would say though is that it might not necessarily be necessary to break up the size of the company, but just to allow or force the company or encourage the company to employ the workers that it's utilizing. So instead of using third-party individuals and leaning on them and chewing them up and spitting them out. Have real employees, give them real wages, allow them to have a collective bargaining unit agreement. And I think that way you would get more productivity out of them in the long run and still be able to run a successful business.
I appreciate that perspective. My concern is that if they're able to stay so big, even if we used the awesome powers of the federal government to force these relationships out of independent contractor relationships into employment relationships, they're still so big that they could reduce the contributions of those employees with the strength that they have. And it is one of the reasons why we had bipartisan support on this committee for those bills. But Mr. Chairman, I'm deeply disappointed that those bills haven't been called up for a vote. It seems a bit odd to be here talking about positive impacts of legislation the subcommittee has passed when the full House has had the opportunity in prior weeks to take up these bills and they haven't. And I have to wonder why that has happened. And so, Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a piece from the New York Times entitled "Tech Giants Fearful of Proposals to Curb Them, Blitz Washington with Lobbying."
Without objection.
And so that could be a reason, the power of lobbyists in this town to make things tougher for workers. I guess there could be other reasons too. Mr. Chairman, I would seek to enter into the record a piece from Yahoo News entitled "Tim Cook Reportedly Called Pelosi to Deliver a Warning About Congress's Antitrust Bills."
Without objection.
So maybe it's the lobbyists, maybe it's the power of these very powerful CEOs making personal calls, but it could even be something more sinister. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a Fortune.com piece entitled "Speaker Nancy Pelosi's Husband Cashed in on Big Tech Just as Congress was set to pounce."
Without objection.
And in that article, there's discussion of the spouse of the Speaker of the House making a $6 million call on stocks that netted $5.3 million while we're not moving these bills. So I thought that was a little odd. I thought that was weird. We moved bipartisan legislation out of this subcommittee, and just as we're considering it, and it might be bad for big tech, the Speaker's spouse goes and buys all this big tech stock, and then lo and behold, here we are with the bills not called up. And it just makes you wonder, did somebody know something? Was somebody acting on information? And it could have been the power of the lobbyists and all the money that they donate to members of Congress on both sides. It could have been people like Tim Cook calling, but here's what we know. These bills aren't coming to the floor. If they were coming to the floor, they would have been on the floor in prior weeks. And so now we sit here with this great work likely extinguished in its tracks for one of these unfortunate reasons. And Mr. Chairman, I know we've got Chairman Nadler's MORE Act coming up soon. And one thing we learned in the marijuana movement is sometimes you got to lose votes on the floor. Sometimes you got to put up the votes, you got to lose, and then year after year, you make a little progress, you get further down the road. And even if these tech bills can't pass, I would encourage you to talk to the Speaker and put them up for a vote. And I know she said she won't put up votes that don't pass, but if it could at least give us a measuring tool to be able to come back and work to persuade our other members. I thank the chairman for his indulgence for going over time, and I yield back.
And I want to reassure the gentleman that I am working very closely with the ranking member of the subcommittee to be sure that our colleagues who have not had the benefit of the 16-month study that we conducted, where we, I think, learned a lot about this marketplace, understood what these complicated bills do. We want to be sure that our colleagues are fully briefed up, and we are committed to making certain these bills come to the floor, not just for a vote, but for a vote that prevails because of the hard work that's been done, and we are grateful for your ongoing and strong support. But this is an important priority for me, I know for all the Democrats in our caucus, and certainly for the chair of the full Judiciary Committee, and working very closely with Mr. Buck to be sure we get to that point. And thank you again for your support of our investigation and the legislation. And with that, I now go to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Gordon for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chairman just said the Trump DOJ was political and went after their opponents. Are you kidding me? 3 weeks ago, the National School Board Association writes President Biden asking him to involve the FBI in local school board matters. 5 days later, the Attorney General of the United States does just that. does exactly what a political organization asked to be done. 5 days. Republicans on this committee have sent the Attorney General 13 letters in the last 6 months. It takes weeks and months to get a response. 8 of the letters, we've got nothing. They just gave us the finger, said, we're not going to get back to you. And all our letters were actually sent to the Attorney General. Here's a letter sent to someone else asking for a specific thing to be done, and in 5 days, the Attorney General does it. Here's what the October 4th memo said. Quote, I'm directing the FBI to convene meetings with local leaders. These meetings will open dedicated lines of communication for threat reporting. Dedicated lines of communication for threat reporting. A snitch line on parents started 5 days after a left-wing political organization asked for it. That's not political. I don't know what is. Where's the dedicated lines of communication with local leaders regarding our southern border? Something that, frankly, is a federal matter. Where's the dedicated lines of communication on violent crime in our cities? Violent crime that has went up in every major urban area where Democrats have defunded the police. Nope, can't do that. Can't do that. The Biden Justice Department is going to go after parents who object to some racist, hate America curriculum. Nope, can't focus on the southern border where 1.7 million illegal encounters have happened this year alone. A record number. MS-13 can just waltz right across the border, but the Department of Justice, they're going to open up a snitch line on parents. Think about this. The same FBI that Mr. Garland is directing to open dedicated lines of communication for reporting on parents just a few years ago spied on 4 American citizens associated with President Trump's campaign. Clinton campaign hired Perkins Coie, who hired Fusion GPS, who hired Christopher Steele, who put a bunch of garbage together, gave it to the FBI. They used that as the basis to open up an investigation into a presidential campaign. Oh, and then there was Mr. Zussman, who worked at Perkins Coie, the firm hired by the Clinton campaign. He cut out all the middlemen. He just said, I'm just going to go directly to the FBI, and not just anyone at the FBI. Who'd he go to? Jim Baker, the chief counsel at the FBI, handed him a bunch of false information, told him false information, and of course, he's been indicted by the special counsel. A few weeks ago, the IG at the Department of Justice released a report that found that the FBI made over 200 errors, omissions, and lies in just 29 randomly selected FISA applications. But don't worry, the Attorney General of the United States just put them in charge of a dedicated line of communication to report on parents who attend school board meetings. Mr. Chairman, Americans are afraid. For the first time during my years in public office, first time, I talked to the good folks I get the privilege of representing in the 4th District of Ohio, folks all around the country. They tell me for the first time they fear their government. And frankly, I think it's obvious why. Every single liberty we enjoy under the First Amendment has been assaulted over the last year. Stop and think about it. Americans were told you couldn't go to church, couldn't go to work, couldn't go to school. Small business owners were told you're not an essential business, close your doors, causing many of them to go bankrupt. We were given curfews, stay-at-home orders. Last fall in Ohio, you had to be in your home at 10. In Pennsylvania, when you were in your home, you had to wear a mask. In Vermont, when you were in your home, you didn't have to wear a mask because you weren't allowed to have friends and family over. And of course, there's always a double standard with these folks. Folks who make the rules never seem to follow them. And now the Biden administration says get a vaccine or lose your job. Even if you've had COVID and have natural immunity, get a vaccine or you will lose your job. Oh, I almost forgot. The Biden administration also wants another dedicated line of communication for reporting. They want a second snitch line. They want banks to report on every single transaction over $600 for every single American to the IRS. The IRS, that agency with its stellar record of customer service, the IRS, you know, the same IRS that targeted conservatives the last time Joe Biden was in the executive branch. Jefferson said once, tyranny is when the people fear the government. We're there. Sadly, we are there, but I don't think the good people of this great country are going to cower and hide. I think your memo, Mr. Attorney General, was the last straw. I think it was the catalyst for a great awakening that is just getting started. Pilots at Southwest Airlines, the Chicago Police Union, parents at school board meetings, Americans are pushing back because Americans value freedom. A few weeks ago, Terry McAuliffe said this: I don't think parents should be telling schools what to teach. When government tells parents we're smarter than you, Americans aren't going to tolerate it. When the Attorney General of the United States sets up a snitch line on parents, Americans aren't going to tolerate it. I think they're going to stand up to this accelerated march to communism that we now see. America's going to fight the good fight. They're going to finish the course. They're going to keep the faith because Americans value freedom. Mr. Chairman, we have a video we'd like to play.
What purpose does Mr. Jordan seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
The Democrats have a bill that says to political jurisdictions, if you change your law, if you do it the way we want you, we'll give you money. And our colleague from North Carolina comes with an amendment and says, if you engage in certain behavior, we're not going to give you that money. It is entirely relevant. The chairman has twice now used the term irrelevant. This is as relevant as it gets. Last week, the Democrats started off the week with one of our colleagues from Detroit saying no more policing. We just heard the gentleman from Rhode Island say the Democrats haven't talked about defunding the police.
No, that's not what I said.
One of their members said
I didn't say we haven't talked
no
about it.
more policing. No more policing. And let me just, the Democrat-run cities, New York City cut $1 billion from its police department's budget and saw a 97% increase in shootings. Los Angeles cut $170 million from its budget, saw an 11.6% increase in homicides. Austin, Texas, $150 million cut, 50% spike in homicides. Portland, Oregon, a $12 million cut, eliminated 3 police units. Shootings went up 173%, murders up 25%. I would bet the people, the residents of those communities think this amendment is relevant, for goodness sake. Democrats started the week last week saying, get rid of police. They ended the week with one of our colleagues, Democrat colleagues, being admonished by a judge for the ridiculous things that they said. And somehow the gentleman from North Carolina's amendment's not relevant? Are you kidding me? This is as relevant as it gets, as timely as it gets. And I hope we could actually agree on something and adopt the gentleman's amendment. With that, I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to make it quite clear that this amendment is completely irrelevant. I served as a law enforcement officer for 27 years. It is a tough job, and good police officers deserve your support. You know, it's interesting to see my colleagues on the other side of the aisle support the police when it is politically convenient to do so. Law enforcement officers risk their lives every day. They deserve better, and the American people deserve. I have the floor, Mr. Jordan.
Lady has
What,
the floor.
did I strike a nerve? Law enforcement officers deserve better than to be utilized as pawns. And you and your colleagues should be ashamed of yourself.
The gentlelady will suspend and the clock will be stopped. I want to admonish members. They must not interrupt someone who has the time.
Mr. Chairman, can I
You
ask a
simply
question?
can't shout out. If you think that someone is saying
I agree.
Mr. Jordan, you don't know what in the heck you're talking about. You know
I do.
nothing about what law enforcement officers
I know about my motive.
And you're using them as pawns because it serves your ridiculous political purpose.
Val, everyone must suspend. I am making the point. No one may shout out when someone else has the time. Not Mr. Gomert.
Question, Mr. Chairman.
Not Mr. Jordan. Nobody.
Not Mr. Cicilline.
Not Miss.
Not Ms.
He
Demings.
didn't do that. But nobody.
Not Mr. Jordan.
Not Ms.
Nobody.
Cicilline. Okay, no, but I agree with that. But
And how do we,
Everybody.
I have a
I
question.
will simply. There is no question.
question.
Nobody may shout out.
When you give
You
a
see,
speech, Mr. Chairman,
nobody
about
may-
motives and questioning motives, and then our motives are questioned,
emotionally
how do we
charging
address
for
that?
me
The rules
because
allow
I
a
was law
request
enforcement officer.
words.
I have
Point of
watched them
inquiry.
live and die, and you know nothing about that.
Really
And to
address-
utilize them as political
Mr. Chairman,
pawns,
I have a point of
pisses me
inquiry.
Off.
People
Chairman,
will
I have a
address
point of
comments
inquiry.
to the chair.
Mr. Chairman.
The rules do not permit shouting out when someone else has the time. The only thing you may do when someone else has the time is you may raise a point of order if you think it proper, and the chair will then rule on the
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman will state his point of order.
So you gave us a lecture on people questioning our motives. When someone questions our motives, how do we address it when they're in the act of questioning our motives?
That is not a point of order.
Yes, it is.
That is not a point of order.
Mr. Chairman, may I continue, please?
That is not a point of order. Ms. Demings has the time, and the clock will resume. Gentlelady's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm glad to hear that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are on the side of law enforcement now. Because I don't know where my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been over the last 4 years, including on January 6th, when police officers who protect us every day were fighting for their lives because of the big lie that was told, and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle were silent. As one person after another person took the microphone and said, go down there and engage in combat, fight like hell. They used the bicycle racks as deadly missiles against the law enforcement officers that you all say you care about so much. And thank you, Mr. Cicilline, because you're absolutely right. The only person who voted to support local governments and pass legislation to support local governments that includes law enforcement were the Democratic members on this side of the aisle. But now today, you support law enforcement. Well, I'm delighted to know that. But don't support them when it's politically convenient for you to do so. Support them when they're under attack by people fighting them and spraying them and knocking them to the ground and beating them with poles, with carrying the American flags and pipes.
Unbelievable.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purposes Mr. Roy seek recognition?